We live in hazardous times. Every second of every day, somewhere in the world, things are happening. Devastating things. Events that might have consequences that no one can foresee. Natural disasters. And man-made ones. Events that can harm people and businesses. We may not be able to stop them happening, but we can be prepared. When an incident disrupts your business, the clock is ticking. There's no time for hesitation, wondering what you can do, how to respond. It's time for action, decisive action. For companies with business continuity plans, it's time to put them into practice.
The scope of the risk is anything from reputational loss that can be overcome over time, right the way through to a complete collapse of a business. Now, one of the key messages about business continuity is around convincing your customers that you can continue to deliver that service under any circumstance. But it goes further than that. It says to your staff that you care enough about their own well-being and livelihoods that you've thought through your ability to be able to recover. And importantly, during a recession, it also says to your owners, your financial backers, that you can also withstand an incident, and therefore their ability to fund you shouldn't be undermined as a result of their concerns should you suffer a disaster.
Business continuity management is vital because failure to develop capability could have a devastating impact on the organisation. But success in taking BCM into the boardroom and risk decision making can actually build a more resilient, more agile business.
For companies without plans, an incident can become a crisis. A crisis can become a catastrophe. Following a disaster, around a quarter of businesses never reopen. 80% of companies that don't recover within a month are likely to go out of business. 75% of companies without business continuity plans fail within 3 years. Times are hard for businesses everywhere. Turmoil in the Eurozone, economic slowdown, sovereign debt crises, the credit squeeze, the threat of global recession. Some businesses will survive, some will go under, and it's a fine line in between. But companies that practice business continuity management are resilient. They have analyzed their business and know what their priorities are. They have identified the things that are essential to them and the things they can manage without for a while. They even know for how long. They have developed plans for protecting their people, their business, their stakeholders, their reputation. And they've tested them to make sure they're effective. Their employees are aware of what to do if there's an incident and where they should carry on working from, if necessary. The aim is to get the business back up and running in the shortest possible time. And it works. When businesses were asked if business continuity management mitigated the impact of a disruption, 82% of them said yes. And 74% said they were able to continue delivering key products and services to their customers. In an uncertain world, companies with business continuity plans have an advantage. When the clock is ticking, they're ahead of the game. If ever there was a time when resilience was needed, the time is now.
Exactly, that is the message, that the time is now for us to become proactive and look at business continuity. So we can move to the next slide. So just to bring everything into perspective, we want to define business continuity as the capability of the organization to continue delivery of products and services. So essentially what we're asking here is, you need to ask yourself, what are my products and services for my organization? Or what is the key mandate of my organization? And can I be able to deliver within acceptable timeframes at predefined capacity during a disruption? Given that the time to act is now, this is something we need to start to think about. Everything about business continuity can be summarized from the definition. And you need to keep asking yourselves, in case of a disruption which is becoming inevitable, can I still deliver? Can I execute the mandate of the organization? And can I do that within acceptable timeframes? and at predefined capacity during a disruption. So business continuity we are usually depending on an ISO standard, which has the requirements for organizations to implement a business continuity management system. And this ISO standard is called ISO 22301. And the latest version is the 2019 version. So it's very appropriate that this version came out just before the pandemic. So it's really fresh, and we can utilize it to ensure that we have effective business continuity plans for our organizations. And business continuity, as mentioned in the video, involves building a culture of resilience against disruptions. And something to note about this bit is that culture does not form overnight. It takes time. We need to build, we need to consistently and implement or look at the scenarios and put in measures so that we are able to restart our critical operations in a timely manner in the event of that inevitable disruption. So that is the long and short around the business continuity. All that we are going to talk about today and in the future about business continuity, it's all about being able to recover in good time and being able to deliver on our mandate based on the interested parties. Moving on. So there's this interesting quote from The Art of War, that the battle is already decided even before it is fought. So every battle is won or lost before it's fought. So the disruptions that we are going to face in now and in the future depends on how prepared we are. The measures we put in place now will determine the outcome of that disruption. So that's why we need to become very proactive, very deliberate in looking at what are the possible disruptions that we may face and what are we doing about it now. So all we are talking about here is planning for that inevitable battle. Next one, please. And why do we implement business continuity? Essentially, it's because we want to recover and be able to deliver. And this is to meet the expectations of our interested parties. We have multiple interested parties. We have our customers, especially our employees, our suppliers, you name them, have an expectation of us as an organization. And you can also use it to look at yourself personally. Who are my interested parties? What are their expectations of me? What do I need to deliver within acceptable timeframes at defined capacity? And what are we doing to ensure that we deliver? So we need to ensure resilience in our key pillars that support delivery of those products and services. And there are many benefits to implementing a business continuity management system. And key benefit is that in the event of that disruption, because we are going to face multiple disruptions, and given that the changing environments that exist in, COVID-19 becoming a good example, we need to be able to still deliver. So if we look at what disruptions or scenarios, then we can better prepare to deliver on our mandate. And I would also like to invite Engineer Gary to talk about business continuity from a regulatory point of view on why we need to implement business continuity.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, it looks like I'm thrown straight into the presentation. But however, as a regulator, we have the mandate to tell licensees what we require of them. It's just unfortunate. It's just unfortunate that at the moment, most people misunderstand BCP to just mean having a redundant link. BCP is a lot more, as you'll learn during this webinar. BCP is a lot more than just having a secondary link for when one link is down. So going forward, I know in Zambia, our regulation is changing to make sure that the licensees, all the mobile providers, all the ISP will have a proper laid down business continuity plan. Now, coming to my presentation, I'm going to look at the BCM life cycle, business continuity management life cycle. What is important about a life cycle is that it keeps on going around and around and around. The first part is understanding the organization. You can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Now, in understanding the organization, it is important that we ask questions about the organization so that we can set up an effective BCP program. Some of the questions is, what are the objectives of the institutions? What systems are we running? What services are offered? Who are the stakeholders? And what are the time imperatives on the delivery of services? Obviously, different organizations, different companies will have different time imperatives on their services. Next slide. Some organizations can continue even after a day. Some will immediately need to be running. Then next slide. So one of the two activities we need to carry out. One of the two activities we need to carry out before we set up our proper BCP plan, our response, is a business impact analysis and a risk analysis, a risk assessment. The business impact analysis, next slide. The business impact analysis looks at what do we have in our system? What are we running? What are the systems that we have running? What are the functions of the unit? For example, you may have a unit that is the finance unit. They do things like payroll. They do things like receiving money. They do things like payments. Those are the different functions. The assets you have in finance, there will be the people, there will be the processes, there will be the systems, and there will be the documentation. Then you look at what is the impact of the loss should your finance department go down. The impact could be financial, network infrastructure, it could be health and safety environment, the reputation, the legal, the compliance, and the regulated. All this, we have to look at each and every one of them. And for each and every one of them, you say, how long can we go down on this? People. If I do not have people, how long can I survive without people? If I don't have systems, how long can I survive without systems? I don't have documentation, how long can I survive? These, together with the risk assessment, will decide what response we put in place. I'll talk about Zambia, for example. If somebody says of what are the risks of having an earthquake, such that our building, we make it mega safe, chances of getting an earthquake in Zambia are very slim. So we will not dwell on that. But there are other areas. One of the areas in Zambia, for example, is power. You know that the chances of losing power are quite high. So you will make sure you have a standby genset in place and make sure it has fuel. So the time that we need before we restore our system is called RTO, recovery time objective. As we go forward, you will see that this is a term that comes on quite often in business continuity, recovery time objective. How quickly can we recover? The next slide. How quickly can we recover and continue with our business? So as you can see there, in this table, we are seeing on some of the plans that you put in place. For example, my colleague will talk about it more. Once you do have a disaster, you need to have a proper crisis management plan, complete with media management, who is going to say what. We like talking about it and calling it damage control, but it's more than damage control. You need somebody who will give the public and your consumers, your customers, if necessary, the government, the right information of what is happening. Keeping quiet is not the answer. The people who will be doing all this communication need to go through some sort of training. They need to know how to say the right things at the right time. Some of these crises we have go out of hand because the wrong people say the wrong things at the wrong time, or that everything is just quiet. People don't know what is happening. And you know what we say about that? When there is no communication, when there's a vacuum in communication, people create their own communication. Next slide. Now, in that life cycle, after we have the different options that we have in place, for example, I did mention that if it's a question of power, the option may be a genset or a secondary line from the utility provider. Then after that, you then sit down and properly develop this BCP response plan. Now, the response plan is in 3 stages, or should I say at 3 levels. The first level is a strategic level. This is a very high level. Now we're talking about the board. Board should be involved in business continuity. Then the second level is the tactical. This is management. Finally, the operational level, the business unit levels. And like I keep saying, these things have to be properly planned and which is the fourth stage is where we need exercising this business plan. Now, the business plan is well and good to write a business plan, put it on the shelf, have it signed off by senior management, have it signed by the board, but you need to exercise it to make sure it works. We test ours twice a year, and every time after testing, you will have, as you are testing it, you may have your internal audit watching, seeing that it's going to plan. At the end of the test, you need to come out with a report which says what did not go right, what went right, so that those which did not go right are corrected for future use. It is no good, just like in a motor vehicle, it's no good having a spare tire which is not pumped, which is flat on its own itself. Because when the time comes, you'll be disappointed. We had a very good experience when COVID hit us and we were forced to work from home. During the first wave, I remember there was a government directive in Zambia to literally shut down offices. Luckily, due to our planning and our BCP here at our offices comes under IT, we already had VPN. So staff could connect from their homes through VPN and access all their files. Our only challenge was our call center, but even that, we very quickly, within the same afternoon, we managed to get cell phones and give our call agents a cell phone each. And then we spoke to the mobile providers to transfer the calls, which were going to our help desk, to transfer them to these 6 cell phones, so that our staff were able to receive calls from home. So for us, I would say, at least in the IT department and the call center, we were very successful. However, other departments When they were forced to work from home, that's when we found a lot of gaps, For example, some staff at the office, they use desktops. Somebody with a desktop now has to work from home. They'll need a laptop. So that was a non-starter. But we did learn a lot, and every day we are trying to improve. Next slide. Now, embedding BCP in the organization, if you remember the first diagram we looked at, this one was all the way around. It was encircling the other four, because it is very important, very, very important to try and get management buy-in, starting from the top, starting from the board level. The board must feel that it is necessary, that it's part of the core requirements of the organization to have a BCP and to embed that BCP culture in them. It should be a top-down approach. I know a lot of companies that have tried the bottom-up approach, and it has not worked. It has not worked. You need full management commitment. If necessary, it can even be added in people's annual scorecard, their annual performance indicators, that they should do something about BCP. Another thing which also needs to come out clearly is that BCP is not just about IT. One of the biggest areas of BCP is staff. When staff are not available, what do you do? So there are certain strategies that can be put in place, including job rotation, so that people can do more than one job, so that people, more than one person knows how something works. You cannot have a situation where there's a certain equipment, for example, where only one person can operate it. Because when a crisis happens, that person is not available. You can shut down a whole organization can shut down. So it is important to have it embedded in the organization with constant repeating of awareness campaigns, teaching, awareness, and we try and make sure we have commitment from the top. The next slide. Okay. So in a nutshell, BCP is something we should all think about. I even say that it should even go beyond the organization. It can even reach your home. It can even reach your home. There are certain issues where even at home, you need to know that if this does not work, what is my next plan? If this fails, what do I do? We should not put ourselves in situations where we are at the mercy of the different forces of life. We need to actively put steps in doing something about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Engineer Gary. And that thank you for the insights that you've given us. And just a quick question from one of the attendees is, how do you put in place a risk mechanism in your business in regards to your cash flows by employees? Direct this to Kiru. Maybe you can give us a bit more insights on this.
Hi, thanks for that, Frederick. From what I understand about the question, it's looking at fraud risk, if I'm not wrong. Looking at the risk around cash loss by your employees. This will probably be perpetuated within the operational controls around fraud. So ideally, when you are looking at the risk management framework for your organization, you need to look at the controls you have and do some vulnerability testing. Where are the weaknesses in the controls when it comes to fraud? What are the wet areas for fraud, first of all? And what are the weaknesses in the controls in that process that we can try and mitigate and reduce the likelihood of loss of cash by employees. I hope I've answered the question. And if not, the participant can bring more context into the question.
Sorry, if I may just add to what Kira said. I know that obviously time is not on our side. One of the measures that can be put in place is to ensure you put in what is called the internal financial controls. So as Kira has correctly mentioned, I think this is a fraud risk because you're talking about the loss of cash. So in your organization, you can implement what has been called the internal financial controls. And in the internal financial controls, one of the aspects is to ensure proper controls are assigned to cash management. So you have things like exception report, reviews that are conducted, you carry out cash management reviews on a regular basis, and then there's that segregation of duties as well. That's what I would add to what Kira said. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalunga. Thank you, Kiri, for your insights. One other question under business continuity is from Christine. She says operational risk can heavily impact an organization during crisis times. How do you handle it, particularly for continuity without disruption? I would direct this to Engineer Gary for him to be able to give us a bit of insights.
Thank you so much. Like I have been trying to say, it's all about how you plan for it, how you plan for it. When you have done your risk assessment properly and your business impact analysis, you plan to say, if this happens, I will do this. If this happens, I will do this. If this happens, I will do this. These things, you then present them to the board because most, if not all of them, involve spending money. The business must be ready to spend money. So if it's a question of systems, you may have backups, you may have a disaster recovery sites. If it's people, you may have cross what do you call this? People trained in different areas, who are able to cover for each other, Or you may have to bring in outsiders to come and help you. If it's infrastructure, you may speak to other, if your office is no longer usable, you may have to speak to other people who have office where you can go and lend some space. So it all depends, number one, what business you are doing, what risks you have, and how much money you have. Yes, there are some companies whose option is do nothing because they look at how much they have and what business they do. If I'm a small business, for example, I'm a small consultancy, maybe I have only 2 employees, I could probably work from anywhere as long as I've got my laptop, as long as I've got internet access, so that if my office is suddenly inaccessible, I'll go and work from somewhere else. So it is all about how you do your business impact analysis and how you do your risk assessment. There are a lot of documents you can find on the internet and on the BCI website, which can help you with this. And I'm sure Sentinel can also help in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Gary. So we'll move on to the second bit of our webinar, whereby we'll be talking crisis management. What is and how to identify crisis? This will be handled by Kalunga. I'd let him take over.
Okay, thank you, Frederick. Are you able to hear me clearly? Frederick?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, so my presentation will just ride on the presentation that has been done by Kiru and Engineer Gary. So crisis management is very much linked to business continuity. So failure of business continuity also will make crisis management fail. So I'll start my presentation from the last part that Gary said about we don't usually ask what if happens. So on a personal level, you find many of us don't want to think about if we lost employment today. It's a crisis we can get in, but we don't want to think about what are we going to do. So a crisis is something that happens because of an expected problem that puts stability of a company at risks, and you find the instability. One of the examples I can give is a true life example that all of us can relate to, is the COVID pandemic. So if you saw the COVID pandemic as illustrated by one of the examples Gary gave, is that at first we were thinking, okay, maybe this is a Chinese problem, maybe this is an Asian problem. But as the COVID started to spread, a lot of organizations, including my own country, Zambia, thought it would be a remote problem that we'll be watching on the news. But you find that it will hit up into your organization. So it's something that was not expected, but we found a lot of people would not come for work. Like Gary illustrated, some people could not work because they don't have remote access and that kind of thing. So that's one of the crisis situations. Crisis situation also emerge when you've got dilemmas. There are many case studies where probably people that are at the top of an organization are involved in an ethical practice. One example that I can relate to is what is very widely known to many of us, is the Enron scandal that happened in the US. So it was an energy giant with a lot of money and making a lot of business growth and everything. But what was not known to many people in the organization, including the regulators, the shareholders, was that despite the company looking very great, there was a lot of internal fraud that was being committed by the senior executive. So there are those dilemmas that can come from internally, and you can also see it from the external point of view. Then crisis also emerge when you've got an escalating problem that becomes out of control. I know one of my colleagues cited about something that spins out of control from the organization. One of the examples I can give is the recent, for those that follow the news, South Africa faced an unrest in a couple of weeks' time, where some political issues spilled out into where people protesting, burning shops, breaking into, looting, and that kind of thing. But one thing that might not come to certain small to medium enterprises was that maybe it might not affect me. But you find that the riots affected people from going to work, it affected the looting that was going to the businesses, a lot of small to medium enterprises have shut down. So it's a problem that spins out of control that you cannot be able, that creates a crisis. And the crises are varied, actually. Like Gary mentioned, if you do your risk assessments, so you're looking at people, you're looking at processes, you're looking at systems. In all those areas that you perform a risk assessment, potentially those where the areas can come. Small issues I can give us, the moments that you hear in an organization that, oh, employees have received a 5%, 1% salary increment. It looks quite small, but potentially that can become a crisis. One day, if you've got a significant workforce that are unionized, they can resolve to not to come for work. What happens if they're down tools? So it becomes a crisis. Now, one of the critical points that needs to be looked at when you're looking at the crisis is, how do you identify a crisis? Like I gave an example on the COVID. In Zambia, we're thinking maybe it might not come through. But at what point do you identify that this might become a crisis issue? So one of the things that you need to consider is when you start seeing imminent threat to an organization, like in the case of COVID, when you start hearing, oh, numbers in the hospitals are increasing, 5% of our workforce are not reporting for work because of the COVID or somebody has done. So now you start identifying to say there's now potential imminent threat to an organization. The second point of what I identify is anything that brings shock and surprise to an organization. So an example I would give is one of the case studies. I know a lot of you, I like to give it as a case study. There was a company in the US which was in the financial market where the executive requested for the people that were creating accounts in order for them to project that they were doing very well and making a lot of money, to paint a picture that the company was growing. So it's something that actually greets you with shock and surprise that the executive team can start to instigate fraud in an organization. That's a point to identify that probably we're reading into a crisis. The other things that come to play, the third one, is that when an organization is given pressure to make some timely and effective decision, and you find a lot of executives are going home and they are spending a lot of nights and not sleepless nights about an issue. Like I cited about small things like a salary increment can actually create a crisis. So it could be something that you are underplaying, but the organization is under pressure to make a decision to say, why everyone, they only increase about a percentage in salary increment. So it creates pressure on decision making, and eventually it can lead to a crisis. We may move on to the next slide. So the 3 stages of the crisis management is, like my colleagues have mentioned, we need to plan for this. So the pre-crisis is where you put in the business continuity, like Michael and the engineer Gary have mentioned. You need to put in preventative measures. So like Gary said, in all the areas that you look into in terms of your mission critical areas, you need to assess to say, what are the things that can potentially go wrong? And what are the measures that we need to put? Like we're talking about the pandemic now. What are the things that we can do as an organization in terms of infectious diseases? And then you now move on to prepare and plan to say, if the risks are known, what are the measures that we can intervene? If today happens, like Gary said, about people not having access to the building, what is it that we can do as a plan B? So if people don't have remote access, one of the things I can share, having coming from telecom experience, is that in telco, there's a lot of innovation around what if. So you'll find a lot of telecom business, they've done a lot of crisis management, business continuity. Like Gary mentioned, you've got people that have got desktop, but you expect them to work from home. What are some of the creative stuff that you've done? What I saw in telecom, they'll come up with an app where someone, like if you work in a call center, you don't have a desktop, you are able to pick up calls using an app. So that create that preparation to a crisis today to say, if a call center is banned today and we don't have a recovery site, so people can go home, sit in a quiet place and still pick up calls. The next stage that you need to do is a crisis response. This very much talks to what has been said by my colleagues in terms of what you plan to do from the business continuity, because as Michael Kiro mentioned, it speaks to maintaining the business, sustaining it, and becoming resilient. And one of the gray areas that I've noticed in my experience in terms of crisis management is that you've got this crisis that has happened, like if you look at the COVID pandemic. Immediately it passes, what people do is they throw away what happened. But I can call on you that it's quite critical to perform what we call the post-crisis management, because the importance of the post-mortem is to ensure that the learnings that you picked up from that particular crisis that you faced, you now put in the measures and improve upon your crisis management plan so that in future, you are able to now deal with the crisis on all those gray areas that are, like Gary mentioned about, one of the things that organizations fail to make about crisis is you find the suppliers are talking to employees, employees are also talking to customers, customers are also talking to the stakeholders like the regulators. It all creates a crisis in the sense that you really don't know what's happening. I'll tell you an example that I can share with you in terms of proper crisis management. There was something that happened to Google last year, of which there was an interruption on Google. So customers globally were not able to access services. It impacted almost everybody globally. So what Google did is that, being an innovative company, they seemed to already have a crisis management, because now we were able to know in terms of what they're doing. Let's say I'm a fan of YouTube. You were able to pick up YouTube and know that it's not being accessed, but they were able to tell you to say, maybe within 10 to 15 minutes, YouTube is, our engineers are working around the clock. And also what was also a learning point was the media communication that went out globally of people understanding. And also the hands-on deck that went on to recover, because within 45 minutes, Google was able to recover all the services that were disrupted. So it's quite key in the case of Google, if you take it through all these 3 stages and find out the post-implementation strategy where you now pick up the learnings, you find that in future, probably Google might not face the interruption that they faced. We may go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is just a high level. I know I saw one of the questions that were relayed to Sentinel on one of the participants is around how you create the crisis management plan. So the first step is to identify the possible types of crisis and their impact. So this one has been covered under Jerry's section. So the same way you do the business continuity plan in terms of you saying, what if the building's not available? What if employees goes on strike? What if there's a political violence? What if we don't have the systems as down? So you go into all those scenario analysis of what types of crises that you can face. Then you assess, like Gary pointed out earlier, you assess what is the impact. What is the impact if your finance department is not available? What is your impact if you've got this vendor that you depend 70%. Where I came from, where I once worked, I know all of you, you know Huawei. You'll find that most of the telecom find themselves in a situation where 80 to 70% of their services are all Huawei. And if you remember in the time that Donald Trump was president of the US, there were sanctions that were done on Huawei. What came to most telecom was, what if that happens to Huawei? How do we recover ourselves from the 70% services that won't be available if Huawei goes down? So you have to take yourself into analyzing of possible scenarios to say, what if this happens? What the impact? Then the second point is to set up roles and teams and communication. Gary spoke about how your communication strategy. I'll be talking about it in a bit. But you need to define what role. So if you look at the guys that are in warehousing, if you are in fast-moving goods, what role should the warehouse play in a crisis situation? What role should the procurement people play? What will be the role for people in communication, public relations, and HR, etc.? The third point is to look at what are the necessary, which is very key, actionable points and steps that need to be taken. So like I've mentioned, in terms of once you set up the roles and you agree on the roles, it's very pertinent that everybody know the action they're supposed to do. So you find there's been examples where I've done some work where you find the PR person is sitting there and they've got their own way of communicating. So it's quite important that this is collaborated to ensure that they know their step is now to inform the media. At what point are the trigger points to say we need to inform the regulator? At what point do we inform the customers? At what point do we inform the customers? So it's very key that roles and responsibility are assigned. The other thing that I'll emphasize, which is the fourth point, is about training. I think Gary spoke about teaching and training. So this has to be an ongoing. I worked for a telecom for the last 13 years. And one of the things that we did best was to ensure the way people go for training in customer management, they go into IT security management, is the way the entire organization should be doing the training about crisis management and BCP. The other thing that comes to mind, which is quite critical on the crisis plan, is to have a monitoring plan. So one of the monitoring plan you can do is what was mentioned by Gary. You can have third parties looking at your crisis plan, where they provide assurance. You've got external auditors, you've got external assurance vendors like Sentinel that can come into your organization and look whether the crisis plan that you've put is adequate and is able to work and is effective. I'll move on to the next slide. I know time is not on our side, so I'll be quite quick. So the critical issues that you need on the crisis management is resources. So resources can only be driven from an executive point of view. So there's need for, like Gary mentioned, about awareness in the organization, the importance of BCP, business continuity management, and also crisis management. So you need to have policies put in place, frameworks has to be in place, the crisis communication procedures to be, and the biggest ticket item you can deliver from the crisis is to have a crisis plan that cuts across. Then you can also segment your crisis plan to look at things like what will be the plan for infectious disease. If you've got political violence in election, you've got issues that will come from the pandemics and et cetera, et cetera. I'll move on to the next slide. So this slide is just the instant structure that you can adopt. I know some of you have already adopted, but from a strategic point of view is to provide oversight in terms of what's happening at an operational tactical level, and also be outward in terms of how you manage your stakeholders. So you've got your customers, you've got your suppliers, you've got the regulators, you've got the government. So it's very key that the executive management plays a very key role in terms of instant management of a crisis. So what happens at the tactical level and operational should filter into the executive level. The second layer, not so much, is inwards, and my colleagues have spoken about the BCPs. So these are the people that are the hands on deck in terms of how they manage the emergency response, and having central coordination by business continuity manager. Business continuity is quite key. And one of the things that you need to do at that tactical level is to ensure that any damage that you have, like Gary mentioned about the impact that it will have, but you really need to also be assessing what is the damage that has happened when a crisis is happening. And then on a tactical level, not so much, but I've just illustrated in terms that you need to have technical recovery, the occupation and health and safety, the emergency response. You have to, in terms of what you're doing from the technology side, the IT, the people, the premises, the resources, suppliers, all this has to be stitched together into the crisis management plan. I'll move on to the next slide. So this one is just how the crisis flow. I'll quickly talk about it. It's quite a busy slide, but I'll just quickly. So if you see the first part there, you have what we call the recovery point objective, which Gary mentioned, and the recovery time objective. So recovery time point objective is what are the things that you are ready to lose. So in terms of that, let's say you've got an IT interruption. What period are you able to lose data if you've got an interruption? So you can define to say within hours. So that becomes business as usual. So you can say 2 hours. So anything that is beyond 2 hours, you regard it as a disruption. Then in that period of disruption now, like Gary mentioned, you've got what we call the RTO. In that RTO, you say we've got 4 hours. So you say this is acceptable time that we're able to lose, to lose and be impacted. But anything that goes beyond the RTO, you say now is a crisis. But from that point, you also need to measure what is a tolerable references. Like in our case, like Gary mentioned about the regulator. When I was in telecom, telecoms are allowed for about a week outage. Okay, that is in the worst case scenario. But now at that point, you need to say, what can we tolerate if the regulator says it's 1 week? So you say maybe 4 days. So if you go on beyond 4 days, then now it becomes a disaster. So damage is happening. But one of the things that is quite critical in terms of the process flow is to ensure that you're proactive in your crisis management. So that means you put in measures before. Then you also have to be responsible. Like if you hear negative media hype around the organization, you have to respond to it. They say no news is good news. So if you're not responding to what's happening to the organization, people take it like it's true. So the recovery of the crisis is also very key, but it's something that is managed between the operational and tactical teams in terms of the business continuity plans that exist. I'll move on to the next slide. So the next slide is just talking about what Gary spoke about, the communication. You really need to define in terms of what you want to get out in a crisis. I saw one of the questions that was asked about how do you deal with the operation. So one of the things I can share with you is that you also have to decide in terms of what goes out. Let's for example, you're in a banking, financial services. Your system is out. You need to define what will be the objective of communicating to the customer. What is it that you want to communicate to the customer that the system is unavailable, you are not able to transact. You also need to define the audience and stakeholders, and then come up with a strategy, and also decide what communication means do you get, which easily get to. So you've got your newspaper, you've got a TV, you've got your radio, your website. How do you easily get to your regulator, customers, and other parties? And then out of the feedback that you're getting, you can redefine your message. Because I've gone in when I was in telecom, you speak about your outage and customers actually start feeding back on your products. It's negative, but it's something that you need to take about to say, if there was a crisis on products, how do we manage the crisis that will affect products, even if it's network-related product? So I'll move on to the last slide. Sorry, the next slide. So this one is just a communication plan. Quickly, just to speak about it, I know the time is almost running out, is how you can interlink. What is very key, like Gary mentioned, is to have a centralized way of communication. So you need to have a center that is a source of information for all the touch points. So you have management that will be interfacing probably with the public officials. And then you have what we may call the command center. So the command center is to manage in a crisis to say anything that is filtering in and out has to come out of the command center. So it feeds into the center that is now communicating. And then also our best practice is that at all the touch points in terms of what's going in the community, what you need to communicate to the employees, to the customers, to the suppliers, to the news media, the regulator, it needs to be centralized and have touch point at every unit who is to communicate what, and the standardized communication that needs to go. It's very key, because the worst case scenario of crisis has been, like Gary mentioned, is when you find that your employees are talking to the suppliers, the employees are talking to your media, you find your employees are also talking to the government. So it's very key that as you speak, as you send out information during a crisis situation, that it's centralized, it's controlled, and it's standardized, and it filters through what you have defined as touch points. For example, I cannot be talking about regulatory when I'm sitting in human resource. So you've got regulatory affairs people that will be talking to. I cannot be talking to the media when I'm in technical. So you've got the people that are doing PR, public relations, now talking to the media. I'll move on to the next slide. This one is just about the what has been said before. My colleagues have mentioned this, but the way you drive business continuity is the way you should also drive crisis management. There are challenges to get buy-in in organization, but what you need to do is to recognize the threat, use them as selling points to all the key stakeholders, starting from your board, the management team, the shareholders, and all the key players. And like I mentioned earlier, you need to respond appropriately. And appropriately, I mean by using your crisis management plan. So if we're faced with infectious diseases, what is our response as a standard? Not people performing this way, the other people are picking up that. The other thing is to ensure that escalation are very clear and controlled. Whenever an incident comes in, who should know, what are they supposed to know, and at what point should they know? Then also what I noticed also in my experience was that sometimes people are managing crisis, they're not given the right, correct authority. And some of them, they don't have the capability. So it speaks back now to the training that we spoke about, that people who are supposed to manage crisis are supposed to be adequately trained. The other thing is effective communication. Like I mentioned, if your communication is not good, then the customer, the public, the other stakeholders assume what they're hearing as grapevine becomes true. And very key, what is important, like I mentioned about the buying in of an organization, sufficient resources has to be assigned to crisis management. You need to put in place. I remember sometimes when I was in telecom, we had some election issues around where network was a problem. We went out of way to get satellite phones to communicate with certain stakeholders. So it's something that people look like, why, it's good for nothing. But as you drive awareness around the importance of crisis management and how much it needs to drive business growth, you find there's a buy-in from the board and other stakeholders for you to get the adequate resources that you need to invest in crisis management. In a nutshell, on limited time I'm given, this is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Kalunga, for the insights under crisis management. And just to go through a few of the questions that have been sent to me, there's a question from Elizabeth. She's asking, what are some of the risks? Because you see, like the way right now we are in a technological environment, and every day technology keeps on changing. We end up seeing new solutions. And she's just asking, like, what are the risks involved in automation? Because like any other process, business continuity and crisis management can also be automated. So what are some of the risks around automation of this? And is this something that is viable for us to be able to take it up?
Okay, maybe I can go first. My response to that one is that around automation and technology, inherently the risk that comes is a cybersecurity risk. So we are talking about the possible hacks, the possible intrusion of system, the possibility of people that are not assigned the right rights, possibility of going through things like hostage on the network. So generally, the automation is coming a lot. I think the biggest bulk of risk that is coming is around the cybersecurity, on how you ensure that your system are cast in stones when it comes to managing security. And in my experience, I would suggest that what you need to do is to have a very broad plan in terms of the cyber security defense. So that will go to address most of the things, because when you look at it from the general perspective point of view, but any implementation that you do for the automation has to be supported by some plan of cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Michael, what are your thoughts on the same?
Similar to Kalunga's, around the data breaches and around cybersecurity. However, in a fast-moving world, we are still encouraging automation of our processes to ensure efficiency, effectiveness, productivity. And we also have solutions to automate our risk management frameworks. Gone are the days, for example, when you look at finance departments, gone are the days when they used to have manual ledgers. Nowadays, it's very hard to find an organization that is managing their ledgers manually. We have found ways to automate to make things work better, to ensure productivity. So in the same breath, we are still advising automation of risk so that we do away with the manual processes and we can have dashboards to tell management that this is the exposure level for the organization at a glance. And to counter the cybersecurity risks, there is need to conduct the risk assessment around loss of confidentiality, integrity, availability of information, so that we can plug again the weaknesses that may exist within our virtual or technical environments. Thank you.
Thank you for the insights. And one other question from one of the attendees is, if in terms of business continuity, maybe this one I'd direct it to Engineer Gary, in terms of business continuity and testing, like testing how effectively your business continuity plan is. What are the best ways to do this? And can the testing, how often do you recommend for testing to be done, for it to be ideally this is how we are supposed to do our business continuity planning?
Thank you. Firstly, let me say something about automation. On automation, my take is it is good to have automation of alerts. I'm still a bit old school. Automation of alerts, then sometimes you need that human touch to come in. I've seen some systems which have some artificial intelligence where they can see that somebody's trying to intrude into your network, it will shut down a port and things like that. They are good and effective for some companies, but it is important that somewhere we have a human being overseeing all this, otherwise it will be taken over by computers. Now, testing. The best way to test is to have somebody independent, like say an internal auditor, to be watching as you test. And for example, yesterday we were talking here as management, where we are looking at one day, just locking up the whole offices, just locking up, get policemen to stand around the office when everybody comes in at 8 o'clock and find it, boom, it's locked up, and you tell everybody, right, go to the disaster recovery center and see what happens. The internal auditor then will be checking, is this working? Is this part working? Is this part working? These people said people will work from home. These people said people will drive to the disaster recovery site. These people said when they're at the disaster recovery site, the things there are already working. So internal audit will be there marking the score. Usually if we are marking the score ourselves, we usually give ourselves very good marks. Testing. Standards are basically, they say twice a year. However, depending on what business you are running and how critical it is, how time critical it is, you may increase the number of tests to more than twice a year. In my first job, I worked for the mines, Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines. They used to have training I believe it was every Thursday or every Tuesday at 14 hours. There was a team called the Proto Team. Every week, come rain or shine, 14 hours, they would have that training where they go through all the process. The siren would ring, they would run to the road, and the motor vehicle assigned to them will pick them up. They will go change into their gear with breathing apparatus and everything, and go through the paces every week. So that way, every week they get a mark. Was it good? Was it bad? Let's change this. So depending on what it is, how critical the system you are protecting is, you can increase the number of times. But generally, we've been testing twice a year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, Frederick, to add to the testing, there's something important that Engineer Gary mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, where understand the organization. What is the context of that organization? And then based on the environment in which your organization exists in, internal and external, document a program that is appropriate, because most of these things need to be customized to fit a certain organization. I cannot pick Sentinel's business continuity framework and paste it on another organization's and for it to be effective. this has to be very specific to the needs and expectations of interested parties, the technology available, the training of our people and their competence, the complexity of our processes, and also the maturity of our business continuity. So as mentioned in the presentation, it's a program. We need to start increasing or improving the maturity step by step. The advice is usually to take small but very consistent and deliberate steps towards maturing your business continuity. Then based on all those factors, determine a suitable program for testing of the business continuity plans.
Thank you so much, Anya, for your insights. At this point in time, I'd like to bring our webinar to a close, and I'd welcome closing remarks, starting from Engineer Gary. Then we move, yeah.
Thank you. Like Mike was trying to say at the end, this business continuity is not something that you can copy and paste. It is very important to know what organization you are dealing with. What are their key deliverables? How long can they last? And even within an organization, different units will have a different return time objectives. For example, if your account is just mainly running payroll, you know, you do payroll maybe once a month. So if they have a breakdown at the wrong time of the month, you know, you can wait good, a week, 2 weeks to have it fixed. But if it's 2 days before payroll, hey, you know, you need to quickly fix it. Otherwise, you will have a crisis on your hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer Gary. And I'll direct the next closing remarks to Kalunga.
Okay, thank you, Frederick. My closing remarks is just to pick up some of the issues we've discussed here, that we need to build capabilities in terms of business continuity. And the capabilities is not just about, like has been said, about documenting the processes, but ensuring that it's embedded in the organization is something that is a living document. Like you've said about the simulation, the test that needs to go. So we need to get all our organization that we're working for to ensure that the business continuity is as much as live as it can. Then from the crisis perspective, like I mentioned in my presentation, there is need to drive a lot of awareness to get the buy-in in the organization. And on the other hand, there's also a need to build a lot of capacity. Like I said, once you're faced with a crisis, the example I gave about the Google, the reason why Google was able to recover within 14 minutes in that crisis situation was because of the capabilities. So it's very pertinent that organizations invest into the skills and capabilities of people that are assigned with crisis management and business continuity. But at the end of the day, what you want is to sustain the business. Without sustaining the business will close. So business continuity and crisis management should be at the top of the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for final remarks, Michael Kiru.
Okay, thanks, Frederick. One underlying factor that I keep on insisting to all of my clients and when I'm speaking on these engagements is that the world is changing. And we should not be rigid. A good example is the way COVID hit us, that forced organizations to change, to implement controls to best fit the requirements that they have. So there is usually a quote by Darwin that it is not the strongest that survive. It is those who are most adaptable to change. Yes, you could have your business continuity plans documented, tested. However, the disruptions could come in very different ways, in ways that we may not have envisioned. And this is why we need to have our risk management in place to look at the what ifs, the scenarios, and to become a bit flexible. You've heard from the presenters how, for example, the call centers were given mobile phones to continue working. that was probably not in the BCP, and that is something that they needed to activate in a timely manner, and that is a change. Become very flexible, become very intentional, think outside the box, and react in a timely manner. Otherwise, the crisis could develop in a disaster that we may not be able to recover from. And as the statistics are mentioning, people without the plans are more vulnerable to not recovering after a disruption. Thank you so much.